The challenge with finding locations for the gospel accounts is that they need to look like ancient lands, but be placed in a modern world. They need to have no signs of civilization, and yet be close enough to civilization to support our modern filming operations.
You're asked to flesh out an entire world, a culture, and hundreds, actually thousands of characters that appear in these accounts, to do so with very limited information actually in the Bible. How do we add enough details to connect with the audience, but without overstepping by introducing teachings or ideas that contradict the Bible's message?
Yes, we wouldn't want to do that, would we? We wouldn't want to overstep and contradict the Bible's message. In other words, the Jehovah's Witness interpretation of the Bible message. That's the problem. That's the dilemma facing the audio-visual department. They have to craft this drama with a narrative that both follows the Bible but also sticks to Jehovah's Witness theology and beliefs. I don't envy them. I'm sure they're going to manage it with or without Jehovah's help. I just found the way they were describing this project, this undertaking, very interesting.
You're asked to flesh out an entire world, a culture, and hundreds, actually thousands of characters that appear in these accounts, to do so with very limited information actually in the Bible.
Very little information actually in the Bible. What he's describing here is embellishment. We want to tell a story our way. We want to create something with information that alludes to things happening that we're not certain about. And that's going to require that we embellish, that we add to the story elements that simply aren't in the scriptures. That's what he's describing here. And this is a perfectly ordinary thing to do in filmmaking, by the way. People need to do this all the time with scripts or with novels that are being adapted for film. It's just that the difference here is it's not just some biopic. It's not just some movie that is creatively expanding on someone's life and making that story fit into a movie, a fictional story that's purely for entertainment. This isn't purely for entertainment. This is to indoctrinate. So this is to imply to the audience that these things really happened as portrayed. And that's why I think this whole undertaking is disingenuous. It's interesting that he's describing the people mentioned in the Bible as characters.
And hundreds, actually thousands of characters that appear in these accounts.
Well, if these accounts are historic, these are more than just characters. These are actual people. I get why he's calling them characters, because he's approaching this from a creative point of view. He's crafting a story, again, requiring embellishment of the Bible account, and he's thinking of them in terms of being characters. But if you really believe in the Bible, if you are first and foremost a Jehovah's Witness, which this guy is, why are you referring to real people as characters? It's almost as though at some level, even he isn't fully convinced that all of these events happened. And if that's the case, he is completely justified. I actually had Dr. Richard Carrier on the channel, thumbnail here, discussing mythicism, which is, how can I put it, a minority position held by some scholars that Jesus may never have even existed. So it's important to stress, not all scholars think this. Arguably, the majority of Bible scholars think that some version of Jesus existed, even if he wasn't walking on water, even if he wasn't feeding the 5,000 and turning water into wine. But there are some scholars, including Dr. Carrier, who've looked at the Gospels, they've looked at history, they've seen the parallels with very similar characters from other cultures, and they've come to the conclusion that Jesus is completely fabricated, a completely fictional character. I'm a little bit on the fence still. It wouldn't surprise me if there was an individual 2,000 years ago in the Middle East whose exploits were wildly blown out of all proportion so that they came to be the Jesus that we think about or is described in the gospel records. But one thing that you can say about the gospel records is that they are strewn with embellishments. We don't know who wrote the gospels, and I'm saying this because I'm aware that many watching will be either Jehovah's Witnesses or people from a literalist, fundamentalist Christian background who don't know this. But the books Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They don't say in them, the book of Matthew as written by Matthew. The book of Mark, I, Mark, am writing this. Nowhere in those books does it say who's written it. They're just versions of a story that aren't assigned to any individual, so we don't know who wrote them. We know more about who wrote the books of the Old Testament than we know who wrote the books of the New Testament. The books of the New Testament, specifically the Gospels, if you line them up against each other, they are strewn with contradictions. Clearly, the writers could not agree on what happened and in what order it happened. And there are differences in theology, different teachings, different ideas about who Jesus was. Sometimes the fact that the whole story is made up is just glaringly obvious. I've spoken before about the account of the virgin birth in Matthew and about how that whole thing is based on a mistranslation of the Hebrew word Alma, which in the Septuagint is translated as a virgin, whereas in the original Hebrew, it simply meant a young woman. So whoever was writing Matthew, rather than basing his research on the original Hebrew, was using a Greek translation of the original Hebrew, namely the Septuagint, and came up against this prophecy about a virgin giving birth, and then constructed this elaborate story about how Jesus came to be born of a virgin, which, if you think about it, negates completely all of the chronology that's given showing Jesus's ancestry and his lineage. What's the point of showing his lineage if he was the product of a miraculous birth through Mary? What's the point of showing Joseph's lineage and Joseph's ancestry if Joseph didn't have anything to do with the birth? So they can't even make their own story line up. The story itself within a gospel isn't even internally consistent, never mind whether it agrees with the other gospel writers. So isn't it interesting how here we are in the 21st century and they're at it again. They're embellishing a story. The gospel writers were coming up with a narrative about a Messiah who ticked all of the boxes so that Jewish people could follow him. They were even saying as they were writing, Jesus did all of these things so that the prophecy in this verse might be fulfilled. Check. Right. Okay, I've written that one in. Okay, what other prophecy do I need to make Jesus fulfill? Oh, here's one. I'll write a story where he fulfills this as well. They're so obviously doing that and making the story check boxes. And isn't it interesting that in the 21st century, they're revisiting this whole thing and shamelessly going through exactly the same process of fabrication and embellishment.